It's good to see so many students here today who are interested in American foreign policy. It is my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Newman here today at Ferris State University to give a conversation on American foreign policy. My name is Piram Prakasam. I'm the director for the international office here at Ferris. I'm also a faculty member in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I would like to invite President Eisler to introduce Ambassador Newman and his wife Elaine.
Thank you, Pyramid. Thank you for being with us today. I know that you're in for a very special treat. We had the opportunity to visit it with the ambassador and his wife over lunch, and the experiences that they've had throughout their lifetime serving the United States in countries all over the world, especially in the Middle East, it's really quite remarkable. A bit of background on Ambassador Newman. He's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, U.S. Ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. He served in Baghdad with the Coalition Provisional Authority, and he was Embassy Baghdad's political and military liaison. For this, he received the Army Outstanding Civilian Service Medal. He's currently president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, and Ambassador, I'm sure that you'll chat more with the group about the American Academy of Diplomacy and the work you do now. And it's an organization of former senior U.S. diplomats dedicated to improving American diplomacy. He's the author of The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. He's received State Department Superior Honor Awards twice in his career. He's a distinguished veteran serving as an Army infantry officer in Vietnam. He holds a Bronze Star, the Army Commendation Medal, and the Combat Infantry Badge. And we're pleased to hear from him today as he shares his thoughts on American foreign policy and diplomacy. And I think at this particular point in our country and its evolution, this is a particularly good time. Ambassador's here today because he wants to hear from you, and he wants to hear what your impressions are of diplomacy and how that fits in this current political environment. I want to thank Piram. Piram, thank you for bringing this today, and I also want to thank Dixie Anderson from the World Affairs Council. Dixie, if you would stand up so we could say thank you to you. Dixie has served 21 years as the head of the World Affairs Council of West Michigan, recently received national recognition for the work that she does. But thank you all for being here. Ambassador, if you could come and join me here. I have a thank you to you from Ferris State University, and this says...
Don't drop it.
I will not. That's usually my line, actually. In grateful appreciation, Ambassador Ronald Newman, President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ferris State University, Tuesday, March 14, 2017. Ambassador Newman.
Thank you. You know, for somebody who spent their career working in the Middle East, I like this optimism that you can engrave the date on it and feel that it will really work that way. I think we've got a film for you. Let me just say a couple words about that before we start, and then I'll pop back up afterwards. There were two films actually made. There's a longer version, which is, I think, a little more dramatic. We got more embassies blowing up than the one you're going to see, but it's a basic introduction, because one of the things we've discovered over time is that America's, a lot of Americans understand diplomacy is important. And then there's this big pause. What does that mean? And that tends not to be so clear. And so the film is a first step to introducing you to diplomacy in a fairly brief compass. And then I'm going to pop back up and talk to you a little more about a few of the things diplomats do and experience. And as you heard, President Eisler, I did 37 years of this business, and a lot of it was routine diplomacy, and then in between I had 3 different wars, and a few riots and mobs and other, things to give a little flavor to life. So we can talk about both, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we'll try to answer your questions, so you can, as you watch the film, if things spark interest, make a note unless you have a steel trap mind and can remember what your question was. And with that, why don't I pause and we'll run the film, and then I will be back up to talk to you.
Diplomats are a force throughout our history, securing alliances, opening markets, negotiating trade deals, and spreading American ideals around the world.
It's easy to understand the 101st Airborne when they go out and they win a big battle for America. It's not as easy to understand the battles that are won every day in the field by America's diplomats abroad.
I go to South Africa with no uncertainties about the rightness of our objectives.
South African president at the time, P.W. Botha, was a fellow out of Central Casting.
He said, "You didn't hear me, did you? I don't want you traveling around our country. I don't want you getting involved in our affairs." He began to rant and rave. His aides were visibly shaken.
Too often, we only recognize their sacrifice when things go wrong.
My first tour, which was in India, it cost me a son to bad medical care. Had we lived in the United States, he would still be with us.
It was in some ways an ideal assignment if it all hadn't come crashing down on the 4th of November.
We have breaking news. An American, we can confirm now, has been killed in Libya tonight at the consulate.
Benghazi was a tragedy. I just think ultimately they got it wrong, proved wrong, and it was a tragic event.
Benghazi and the way it has been politicized in our domestic debate has made Washington, frankly, scared of taking any losses, and I think that will continue whichever party is has the next administration.
I was the last one up and had taken a few steps when this boom, huge percussion came and threw me back. I thought, I'm going to die.
It's done because people love the concept of serving their country, and they love the idea of taking American ideals abroad.
These are the foot soldiers on the front lines of America's foreign policy. These are America's diplomats.
Let me just say a couple of words about why we need diplomacy in today's world. We are, that is we, the Foreign Service, the diplomats, are the first line of defense in much of the world. We are the people on the ground in 270 countries. There's nobody else, no other department of the United States government that is deployed worldwide the way the Foreign Service is. And when crises happen, they don't always happen in the places that one was expecting. For instance, Mali in northern sub-Saharan Africa, pretty much a forgotten country for the United States, not a place that we had in our spotlight. Certainly our journalists weren't going there, probably a few Africanists and our academics. But all of a sudden you had a coup, a democratic government overthrown, and then you had the Islamic State making common cause with the rebels, and you had a foreign intervention, and you had the French military in. It's really important when you have that kind of explosion that you have somebody who actually understands the politics. What are you messing about with? That's the role of the Foreign Service. Foreign Service obviously has been, diplomats have been key in some of the big negotiations that, history marks, the Dayton Accords that ended the Bosnian War, ended years of killing, massacres. That was a diplomatic triumph led by a diplomat. Backed up, I will say, by force. Secretary Baker once said it's a lot easier to negotiate when you have the 82nd Airborne in your pocket. And that is true. And the two work together. They're not always alternatives. But there are other kinds of crises some of you will remember that a few years ago we had a massive health problem with Ebola. Huge infectious problem in West Africa. The United States mobilized a major effort to put doctors, public health people in to those dangerous areas to contain the spread of Ebola. And who were the people who set up all the facilities, who got them into the country, who organized everything on the ground so the public health could work? It was our diplomats. We did not withdraw our diplomats from the West African nations that were affected with Ebola. We left them there. In fact, we reinforced them in order to serve as the bedrock for the public health program. I'm getting a little echo in the microphone. Are you getting that, or is that just me? A little bit, I don't know. Speak clearly. So that's one of the reasons we have the Foreign Service on the ground. Additionally, protection of American citizens. If you get in trouble overseas, we, the diplomats, are the people who will be first to help you if we can. Now, if you break foreign laws, we'll get you a lawyer. Actually, we'll give you a list of lawyers. You have to get one yourself. But in a lot of other circumstances, that will be to the embassy people turn, lost passports, lost tickets, mugged in the street, whatever. And some more bizarre cases that I've had in my time. So, protection of American citizens. You heard in the film something about support for American commerce. Big role of the Foreign Service. And two different kinds of roles, really. One is helping smaller companies get located abroad. People forget, we're having a lot of discussion these days about imports into the States, but we have a huge export sector, both of products and of services and of financial goods. Big companies tend to be fairly well established, know what they're doing overseas. Smaller companies often do not, especially when the American economy turns down, they need to find an export market. That's something we do. The other big piece is helping big companies compete against foreign competition. We recently had a case, big airline sailed to Ethiopia where they had a very corrupt process, and the embassy undertook a program that worked for about 2 years and finally reversed that, and the sale went to American aircraft manufacturers. And it was a fascinating effort of sort of embarrassing the government into honesty, which eventually worked. So support for commerce, another big piece, which is not just about individual sales, it's also about developing the standards. Frankly, our European competitors are much better than the United States is at going in and offering free help to countries that are trying to develop standards for all kinds of products. And often they help them develop standards that exclude American products, as if your technical standards aren't the same or don't at least include ours, suddenly you can't compete. So what I sort of want to leave you with for starters is there are about 8,000 American Foreign Service officers, another 6,000 specialists. There's also a big contingent of civil service people who work in the United States, don't deploy overseas. And then we have about, I think it's about 35,000 local employees, foreigners who are employed in our embassies all over the world. So the total size of the State Department diplomacy is about 70,000 people. Fairly large, but in terms of the military, pretty small. When you get down to foreign service officers, the ones that do the substantive work at the embassies, that's a little more than one brigade, an equivalent. And there are actually more people in the military bands than there are in the Foreign Service. It gives you a relative sense of perspective. But it is an important profession. It is a profession, comes in by competitive examination, takes an oath, same oath the military takes to the Constitution. It's actually an oath developed by the first Congress of the United States, and it's the same oath the President takes on inauguration, the same oath the military takes. And it's an oath to the Constitution, not to the leadership. That was a first that oath, when it was developed, was the first time that there was an allegiance sworn to an institution, the Constitution, rather than to a person in the government. And it was revolutionary at the time. So we do that. We have rank in person the way the military does. That is, you're the same rank you are, whatever job you go to. It's not like the civil service where you change jobs to get promoted. And we also, like the military, have an up or out system. You have to be promoted at a certain rate or you are gracefully retired. And we take a pledge on entering into the Foreign Service to be worldwide available. We can be sent anywhere in the world, and we do. So that's an introduction to why the United States needs and has a professional Foreign Service for its diplomatic corps, and I'm happy to take any questions. Please. Wait for the mic.
Wow. I was
You're
wondering, what kind of changes have you seen with this kind of boost of social and news media in the recent years? What kind of changes in this profession have you seen?
A lot, although not always well understood. We have always had the problem that to some extent you're in competition's the wrong word, and yet you can't avoid being in competition with the news cycle. Because the news cycle will also or often determine what Washington is reacting to when they wake up in the morning. So when the news cycle is 24/7, they'll always wake up to something new, almost never good. And that will drive a lot of your time in responding. Obviously, the prevalence of electronic media has made all kinds of huge changes in the world. The whole Arab Spring, as it was called, the Arab revolts that began in 2011 in Tunisia and Egypt, Yemen, Libya, were heavily influenced by electronic media. That has also, I think, produced a certain confusion that maybe you don't need the diplomats, it's all out there electronically. Well, it's not. For one thing, we have few journalists who speak foreign languages, so that we've become heavily dependent in the news media on English language sources. So if you watched, I don't know how many of you were watching the news in 2011, but if you were watching the news in Egypt and the Tahrir Square independence, most of the interviews were with English speakers. And you would have had the notion that this was a very progressive, kind of secular democratic movement, and then you would have been really amazed that they elected a Muslim Brotherhood president in the first election. It was not amazing to the Foreign Service, I think to academic analysts. There is a profound need for understanding of what events mean and what's behind them. That has not changed with the electronic media, but it has to be integrated. The way we do a lot of business has changed, and we've also seen some, I don't know whether it's fashion or fad, we moved particularly in the last 8, maybe a little longer, 10 years, into seeing diplomats as representatives to peoples. We may be moving away from that a little bit because there is sometimes a contradiction between whether you're a representative of America to people or whether you're a representative of America to a government. And sometimes it works to be both, and sometimes that is terribly resented by the government, and sometimes you don't care about that resentment, you want to do it anyway, and sometimes it really gets in the way of more important interests. And so whether you use the electronic media to speak to the world of your country or not, it has to be at least thought through. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it because the government won't like it. It does mean that if you're going to really screw up your relations by doing it, you better think about that first and decide that that's a price you want to pay for doing it, not just do it by accident. Who's got the next one? Who's got the mic? You got the mic. Who's got the question?
Gotta make me run.
You're going to get your exercise here. Somebody close here is going to have the next question, so we don't have to do a marathon.
So I kind of have two questions.
Okay.
First question is, what is your opinion on the new immigration ban, and does that cause any conflict or problems within your department?
My opinion on,
Like the new foreign policy, Trump's new foreign policy.
well, that's a two-part question, mine and what's going on in the department.
Right.
Okay. Personally, I think take a deep breath and be a little patient. This is, for a lot of people, this is the first transition to a radically different administration they've known, and it's very traumatic, including inside the State Department. This is the 9th transition that I've seen. I feel terribly old when I say that, but it makes me a little more patient. And we're seeing a lot of things change. Now, I think there's some very dangerous tendencies out there, but I don't know whether they'll be exercised in policy. So I would elect to wait until you see what actually happens. Because already from the election campaign to 6 weeks in, we've changed policy on, appear to have changed policy on NATO. We've recognized the importance of one China. We're recognizing the importance of our relations with Japan. So I'll be a little patient. Yes, there's a lot of consternation inside the department. Some of that has been expressed, I think, a little too publicly. But basically, the traditional, and I think it is still the view of Foreign Service, is if you oppose policies, you have 3 choices. You can argue against the policy internally. You may lose. I've won some, lost some over the years. You can ask to be reassigned to another job where you won't have to deal with that policy. Or you can resign, and then you can go public if you want to. But those are your 3 choices. Going public while serving internally is not one of your choices professionally. People are having to deal with that. But I think we will get through this. I could go on if somebody wants me to, but next question. Happy to take career questions as well, or we've worn you out. Yeah.
I'm coming. Shouldn't have worn heels.
We've all heard of political appointments for ambassadorships and the like. Talk a little bit about the interaction between those professionals and those who are the beneficiaries of political rewards.
We have 2 types of political appointments that don't come from the career service. We have political appointments to ambassadorships, which not exclusively, but tend to be heavily oriented toward large campaign donors and are largely bought. And we have political appointments to senior positions in Washington, which tend to be much more a matter of ideological or policy affinity with the administration. And they pose 2 different kinds of problems and need to be a bit segregated. Now, we've always had non-career political appointees. Phil mentioned Benjamin Franklin. He was our first political appointee. Well, actually, it wasn't his first because he went out to replace somebody else. So that's a long tradition. We didn't get around to having professional diplomats really until beginning of the 19th century. Most of the people who get those appointments take them fairly seriously. We are the only major power in the world that regularly appoints people who have given much money to the candidate as ambassadors, which technically appears to be contrary to law, but we don't pay much attention to that. Historically, about 30% of the embassies go to non-career political appointees, about 70% to career people. We'll see what happens this time around. When you send, well, first of all, I would like to be able to take the position that career appointees are always good and political appointees are always bad. That would be very satisfying as a career officer, but it's not true. I have known poor professionals, and I have known some very good, we've had some incredibly proficient people who have been political appointees, including, I might add, my father. But, people like Mansfield and Arthur Burns, who was head of the Fed, and some of these, Ellsworth Bunker in an earlier period, Harriman. So we've had some very big figures who've been political appointees and were competent. And then we've had some who were absolutely rotten. In the last administration, there were at least 3 who resigned their ambassadorships before the inspection reports were published on their embassies. One in Luxembourg, where the lead paragraph of the inspection report that was put on the web noted that this ambassador single-handedly destroyed the morale of the mission and that people are curtailing out of Luxembourg to volunteer for Afghanistan and Iraq. And kind of tells you that one's not quite cutting it. I don't think the practice is great. I'd like to see it limited, at least. I think the most important thing is to have qualifications. And there's been some effort to improve the statement of qualifications, but I'm not sure whether anybody cares. It's probably not hugely important for some countries, but you start sending people, the biggest danger is you send people with no track record to a country that has some issues for us. And you're basically just rolling the dice because there's no track record on whether that person's going to be competent. Some of them may be, some of them have been. But that's kind of risky way to treat your relations. The other completely separate problem is the proportion of political appointees to senior positions in the State Department. You'll always have that. It's nothing wrong with that. After all, ultimately policy is made by your elected representatives. But the balance has shifted. We used to be about 60% of the assistant secretary's equivalent above positions were career. Now it's about 25%, real shrinkage. Of the, you can't say about this administration because they haven't appointed anybody, so we'll know later, but in the Obama administration, of the top 10 positions in the State Department, 7 were non-career, were political appointees. And one of the career was administrative. So there were really only 2 out of 9 who brought experience from the field. What that costs you is the view of people who have dealt with the foreigners where ultimately your policy has to be implemented. Now, Americans have a long tradition of making foreign policy with no relationship to foreigners, I understand that. But at the end of the day, you have to implement the policy and then, dang it, there are those foreigners. So it's really useful if in making policy, you have a breadth of opinion and experience that has dealt with making policy work in a variety of countries. When you overload the political side, even though people may be very intelligent and they may have a lot of experience in the area, in most cases they have no experience with actually having to make policy work with foreigners. And so our view in the Academy is that that process has gone way too far. It's not that you shouldn't have political appointees in the State Department, but you need a better balance, and we don't have it. Where's the, here, you're over. Oh, okay, we're gonna work across.
Hi, thanks. This is really fascinating talk. I remember when the documents about Iran were declassified by the CIA and how interesting that was to read what had gone on since 1953 and then under the Shah Pahlavi. And I'm wondering, does the State Department ever make its documents or experiences of ambassadors available? Because I'd be fascinated to read those.
Yes, in a number of ways, although it's very difficult to declassify them as fast as we seem to leak them. You know, some of that is WikiLeaks and that sort of stuff, but then, you know, my father once joked that the ship of state is the only vessel that leaks from the top. You have a lot of politically oriented leaks as well. But there are a number of ways in which documents are declassified. There's something called the Foreign Affairs of the United States, which is a regular declassification process, but it lags by about 30 years. But for instance, a lot of the stuff on Iran would now be declassified in there. In addition, you have an organization that does oral histories of retired diplomats. There are about 2,000 of those now available on the Library of Congress website, where they have interviewed people after their retirement. I did one of those, and they sort of walk through your whole career. They're a mixed bag because you're dealing mostly with memory, which is a little fallible, but they're there. And then there are things that are declassified in response to specific requests, which is, again, very, very subject-oriented and usually not as fast as people want. Last year it got really slow because the entire staff for declassification was working on Hillary Clinton's emails, so they weren't declassifying anything else. But those are all different processes. I'm finally finishing up a memoir that I'll publish sometime in the next few months, and there'll be one more that you can read. So there. The websites through the Library of Congress, yeah, for the oral histories. So there are a number of places where you can get this, and then of course there are a lot of scholarly books where they interview people, and you get a lot of insight as well.
Yeah, you were ambassador to 3 Islamic countries, and so I was wondering what your thoughts are about the recent animosity towards Muslims in the United States and how that's going to affect our foreign policy, and what should be the foreign policy attitude towards Islam in the world.
Well, the United States is founded on the basis of religious freedom and the basis of non-discrimination, and I think that is a policy from our founding fathers that we ought to keep. Now, within Islam, you have some major problems, and you have a huge struggle going on within Islam about the future direction of the faith, and you have a very small group of very, very violent people, very dangerous people. And some of them definitely wish us harm. And you can't totally avoid that. You can't just say that doesn't exist. It is a huge mistake, though, to turn that into a kind of anti-Islamic policy. I mean, we've gone through this in the United States before. We went with other groups and other religions. We went through an anti-Chinese policy, where you couldn't have Chinese, where we were blocking Chinese immigrants. And we went, of course, in World War II through the anti-Japanese American period, where we had Japanese Americans fighting overseas, and we had their parents locked up in camps because we were, wild about what the danger of this might portend. I see this as being similar. It leads us, by and large, into doing dumb things. So that, for instance, one of the countries that's been put on the list to not let new people in is Iran. Well, first of all, Iran has some real terrorist issues, but they're not directed, they have not been directed against the United States internally. Secondly, one of the most subversive things we do is to educate Iranians. We have, I think it's about 35,000 Iranian students in the States right now. And, they're all getting a look at a fairly permissive secular culture with multiple values, and most of them are going back. And that's probably not something that helps the Islamic regime of Iran to solidify its control. So cutting off those people, I don't think is wise. In fact, some of the smartest foreign policies we've had over the years have been foreign education, which is very long-term, doesn't pay off short-term. But I remember when I served in Yemen in the early 80s, there was hardly anybody in the technocratic ministries who spoke English even. When I went back, when I was a deputy assistant secretary a decade later, and Yemen was one of the countries I covered, and I went back, almost every one of the technocratic ministries was headed by an American university graduate. And they knew us. They not only spoke English, they understood the United States. They were all there because of US aid programs that had educated them. So naturally, we were going to end that program. We're not all. Education is expensive, as most of you in this room, I'm sure, know. And it's long-term in its payout. And that's hard for Americans politically. But I think when you cut us off from that, you're making a real mistake. Now, there is going to be a tough balancing act for some years between how we screen people who are a danger and don't become anti-Islamic in the process. And that's going to be a tough road to hoe, but it's one we're capable of doing. And it's not where our greatest, it's not clearly not where our greatest terrorist threat lies, because we've had far more in recent terrorist attacks from people inside the states than outside. But there is a problem, and we have to find a way to balance. It's going to be tough, but we shouldn't let that balance tilt us to being anti-Muslim, including the fact that we have a very large Muslim community in the United States, many of them serving in our military, in our government, and being very loyal people. We should not go back to the Japanese period, to the Chinese period, where we're doing large-scale racial or ethnic discrimination, is my view. Got one here and one there, at least they're close together.
If I may, I'd like to ask a question to your wife, actually.
Sure. Whether she answers is her business. But.
While in these primarily Islamic countries, do you choose to adopt the way that the women dress, and why?
You're on.
Generally speaking, I tend to dress conservatively. In other words, if most of the women are wearing long-sleeved, high-neck, long skirts, I will use my slacks on a tunic top, maybe down to here as far as the sleeve is concerned, but not necessarily exactly like them. I put my own personality into it. They accept it. They accept me because I'm an American, I'm not them. I think that's basically it.
You didn't
really.
cover your hair.
I didn't cover my hair. But of course, we were not in Iran or in Saudi Arabia. Well, in Iran. We didn't live in Iran during the time when women had to cover their head. I was accepted just as I was. I could have dressed very much like I am today. In Saudi Arabia, yes, in the 80s, I had to cover my head, to be sure. In Qatar, yes, I had to cover my head. But that was it.
Question was up there.
As a former ambassador to Afghanistan, you've seen the Middle East and how unstable a lot of areas are. How do you guys find the balance between allowing American soldiers the ability to defend themselves with proper ROEs or tying their hands behind their back and ordering them to stand down? How do these ROEs affect your job as an ambassador?
Directly, not at all, because the ROEs are drawn by military command, not by us. That issue came up most strongly of course, in Afghanistan during the McChrystal period. May have also been, by the way, does everybody know what an ROE is? That's rules of engagement. That's who you're allowed to shoot when, I mean, in simplified form. And the problem General McChrystal was addressing was one of too many civilian deaths, and he imposed some rules which some found too restrictive for our people when they got into firefights. That would be purely, almost purely a military issue, although you might have had a State Department input in the fact that, for instance, President Karzai complained about civilian casualties for 7 or 8 years before we began to take him seriously. And at the end of the period, he was getting very vocal, almost irrational about it. Had we paid attention earlier, we might have found a better balance. The place where we will try to get involved will be whether you understand the culture enough that the ROE makes sense in the culture. That will be, for instance, in Iraq, and this is very difficult because generally these things are done absolutely without the civilians' involvement, and it's actually kind of hard to get involved. But for instance, in Iraq, people rolling around in Humvees would use a clenched hand to tell somebody to back off. Except Iraqis don't know that a clenched hand means stop. This means stop. Clenched hand means nothing. I don't know how many people we killed because they thought that's an interesting gesture while they sped up. There's a problem of cultural adaptation. And this wasn't just a Blackwater problem. It was a problem, and it wasn't just an American problem. It was a problem with every military unit that came in, as well as contractors, if they weren't comfortable in the country. And so the number of incidents would go up with new units, and the number would go down as people got more comfortable. New Canadian unit came into Kandahar, shot up the convoy of the local station chief, the Afghan general in charge, and a few other things before they got completely comfortable with the surrounding. Our biggest problem right now as civilians is not the ROE. It's a too restrictive, not the military ROE, it's a too restrictive civilian ROE that we're not going out enough. We're not interacting with people because Washington is petrified of losses after Benghazi and is enforcing a almost zero risk kind of mentality which can't be deployed. You can't function that way. We would probably, but bottom line, we would not generally get very involved in the ROE. We would get involved in the higher level discussion of, is this getting out of hand, or is the collateral damage of some kind of operation undermining the political purpose for which you're fighting in the first place? The answer to that kind of question is never going to be black and white or simple. But that's where we would get involved. Does that answer, or do I need to, do you need to do a follow-up?
I kind of expected it to, be a hard answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a hard decision to make at any time. And the other side was hard too. It was hard to explain to President Karzai that if you're having a firefight and your opponents pull back into a house, which they regularly do, you can't be in a position where they always have a get out of jail free card if they've pulled into a house, because you can't bomb them. But that was a little hard to understand. And then Afghans have some hard things too. I remember at one point we were doing some after action about a fight the Dutch got into in Uruzgan, and they were complaining about the number of civilians that got killed in the after action. They were interviewing one guy, and his uncle was killed, and it's terrible, you killed my uncle, he's a civilian. They said, well, what was your uncle doing? Well, he was shooting. Well, what do you mean? Well, the foreigners came, and it was the manly thing to do to get in the battle and shoot, but you killed him, and he's a civilian. You have some contextual issues you got to deal with too. Ma'am, one here. You can't avoid it.
Okay. So a buzzword we keep hearing is fake news, fake news, fake news. So as a diplomat, what do you suggest for just like the general public to be informed and to make better decisions on our own too. When these issues are coming up, how do we see things from different directions?
Ooh. Yeah, that's tough because we're going to be such a small part of the problem. I mean, there's a much larger problem than the diplomats with dealing with fake news. There's two problems. I mean, there's problems of stories that are wrong or they're contextually wrong, and then there's stories that are just fake. They're just completely false, which is a different problem. On the false side, that's partly going to have to be the news media themselves. It's partly going to have to be people willing to look at whether strange-sounding stuff might be true. I mean, there's a big problem which has nothing to do with diplomats and which is very hard to deal with, about people looking only at news sources that support the opinion they already have. And that's not a new phenomenon. Eric Hoffer wrote about it in the 50s, The True Believer. But when people talk only to people who share their views, they tend to sort of spin themselves up, and they tend more and more to the view that whatever they think is true. And anybody who doesn't agree must therefore be a hypocrite or a liar because this is so evidently true, and how could anybody else not believe it? The antidote for that is free discussion, whether it's on a college campus or in pages of a newspaper or wherever. You have to have an atmosphere that allows you to debate ideas. For the diplomats, the majority of the fake news has nothing to do, isn't about foreign policy. Where there is, you've got to deal with local knowledge. What you'll deal with more as a diplomat is rumor mill. Stuff that isn't necessarily news, but it's what people think is going on, and that's part of your perpetual job, is trying to sift that stuff and get down. And a lot of that is just basic political skills, which are actually very akin to being a historian. Do you have multiple sources? Are the sources in a position to know what they're talking about? Are they close in time to the event they're describing? Actually, history is not a bad, historical training is not a bad training to be a political officer, because there are a lot of the same, but so is journalism. Except that nowadays we tend to rush out stories too fast to check. But I don't know, that's a very incomplete answer, but it's really the only one I can give you, I think.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had advice for people wanting to try to find truth in some of the things that go on.
I mean, first of all, of course, you've got things like Scopes and other places to go. When you see a story that looks really wild, there are fact-checker sources that are pretty easy to, as a first resort, to just say, is the story wildly untrue? Beyond that, all I can really suggest is that it's important to read a mix of news sources that don't only represent the opinion you like. Sometimes you also learn something. What do we do? A quick follow-up, and then we'll do one right there. Okay.
In regards to the idea of fake news, when I spent a lot of time abroad and I talked to people about their perceptions of U.S. policy, foreign policy, and what U.S. goals were, it was often very, a lot of people have a lot of, very maybe conspiratorial ideas, or maybe oftentimes thinking the worst. And I was wondering what the Foreign Service and what you, when you were
that's
in the Middle
something we
East.
engage on a lot. I think we could do it better. A very wise Algerian diplomat who had run Algerian propaganda against the French in their war once gave me the best advice I ever had on dealing with that kind of thing. He said, when you have a bad story, never apologize, always explain. We often don't explain policies as well as I think we should. We use talking points, and they're kind of sterile. And that tends, or we try to spin things. And spinning is one of the worst things you can do for your credibility. It just blows it out the window. Some of the worst I watched was in the early days in Iraq, where the journalists had absolutely no regard for what was in the daily briefing because it was so obviously spin. And so it just discredited anything good. So engagement, explaining. For a lot of countries, there is a huge disbelief in electronic media because they don't believe in state media. They don't believe in their own government. They don't believe in other governments. So that doesn't mean you can, work with a quill pen, but in a lot of countries, you've got to maximize your ability to work and reach out to people and meet them face to face, because that has inherently more credibility than posting. I mean, you can have 5,000 hits, but if 4,999 of them don't believe you, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. Where the personal credibility will often actually spread as people talk to other people, and it's a little counterintuitive because we want to do it all technologically, but actually you have to work very hard. So it's engagement, explanation, understanding what the stories are, but we're a big power and we're probably always going to have the problem, but those are the main tools.
Last question.
We have this guy in North Korea launched a missile like playing firework, detonate a few nuclear bombs like playing firecracker. In the past, we have been relying upon China to help us out. Now, the recent advice from China is we need to listen and we need to pay more attention to North Korea. That's the Chinese response to the way we put on this thought defense system. So how much more do we have to give? How much more can we take out of this diplomatic front?
Quite honestly, I'm not the right person to ask because I'm not a Korean expert. Also, I've never heard of anybody who claimed that they actually understood North Korea, which would probably be a good place to start. The only thing I can say is that one of the greatest elements of stability is solid South Korean-American alliance. That if that is solid, even if the North is pretty squirrely, they know that a war is a war with the United States. That has the power to destroy them, even though they could hurt us. If we cause doubt about that alliance, then you open up the door to the risk of miscalculation, which could be extremely dangerous to both countries. I think, particularly as the North Korean leadership looks really rather strange these days, it is extremely important to keep that alliance solidly in place. Beyond that, how one ought to react to Korea, I have to leave the answer to that to people who actually have some basis for their answer. But I apologize, but that's not an area that I can pretend to expertise, and I get really tired of people who answer questions. I don't know anything about the question, but let me tell you something. So I will try not to do that. Thank you all.
I will keep listening to BBC anyway.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for enjoying the movie.